I remember the first time I realized something had shifted between my family and me. It wasn't sudden, like a scream in the night or a slammed door. It was quieter, more insidious. It was in the way my daughter avoided my gaze when I walked into the kitchen, in the way my husband's hands lingered on his phone a second too long when I asked about dinner. I had returned from a short holiday in the south of France, a week spent chasing warmth, light, and perhaps an escape from the shadows I'd been carrying in my chest for years. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me when I opened my front door. My luggage was sprawled across the driveway, a few pieces battered and scuffed as if they had been thrown. On top of them rested a folded note, written in my daughter's handwriting, neat and cruel in its precision. "Sorry, Mom, no room for you, so I..." The ellipsis, as if my presence was some unfinished business she could not bring herself to complete, cut deeper than any words she might have chosen. I stared at it for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The early August sun painted the white walls of our small English townhouse in a golden light, but it did nothing to warm the chill that had crept into my bones. I could hear the distant laughter of children playing on the street, their voices light and carefree, oblivious to the weight of adult betrayals. I had raised 2 children in this house, nurtured them, fought for them, and yet in this single, quiet act, my daughter had reduced me to a stranger on my own doorstep. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender, the scent I had chosen to welcome myself back home. Now it was tainted by the bitter reality of my rejection. I sank onto the doorstep, my fingers brushing over the rough paper, over the precise letters that had severed our bond in one swift stroke. "No room for you," I whispered aloud, though the wind carried my voice nowhere. My husband had left a month before on some work trip in Germany. He didn't answer my calls anymore, and I knew, deep down, he wouldn't. I thought back to the holiday itself, the moments I had allowed myself to dream. The sun on the Riviera had kissed my skin, the sea had whispered gentle promises, and for the first time in years, I had imagined that the world could still be kind to me. Perhaps that was my crime, daring to imagine a life where I wasn't invisible. As I unpacked the few items that hadn't been ruined by the journey across the lawn, I remembered another moment, years ago, that had marked the beginning of this slow fracture. My daughter, then just 12, had stood in the doorway of my bedroom, her arms crossed, and said, "Why do you always make everything about you, Mom?" I had laughed it off then, assuming it was teenage rebellion, a momentary sting, but the words had lodged themselves into my chest like a splinter, and over the years, they had festered, feeding a silent bitterness. I wondered how it had escalated to this point. Did she even remember the little kindnesses I had sown into her life? The late nights helping with homework, the breakfast sandwiches packed in brown paper bags, the small notes left on her pillow wishing her luck on exams. Had it all meant nothing? My fingers lingered over the note again, the neat cursive, a cruel contrast to the jagged edges of my emotions. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I knew the truth. Confrontation would likely push her further away. So, I did what I always did. I retreated into myself, into the rooms of the house that felt suddenly alien, and I listened. I listened for the echo of my daughter's voice in the hallways, in the kitchen, in the empty spaces between us. In the quiet, I began to remember other moments of betrayal, small, almost imperceptible acts that had accumulated into a mountain I could no longer climb. The time my husband had signed a lease on a flat without telling me, assuming I would agree silently. The time my daughter had deleted my emails, my attempts to reach out, my efforts to bridge the distance that had grown like ivy over the walls of our family. It was in these memories that I felt the first true pang of despair. A sharp reminder that love could be both sustaining and destroying, depending on who wielded it. I had always believed in the sanctity of family, in the unspoken bond that supposedly transcended grievances. But now, at 48 years old, with silver strands peeking through my once dark hair and lines carved deep from years of laughter and sorrow, I realized that family could be fragile, shattering under the weight of secrets, lies, and unspoken resentments. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about love, betrayal, and the quiet moments that define our lives. I wandered through the house that evening like a ghost, touching objects that had once been infused with memories, now tainted by the absence of warmth. My daughter's bedroom door remained closed, and I did not knock. The kitchen smelled faintly of the dinner she hadn't made. The living room, where I had spent countless evenings reading aloud or watching films, seemed like a museum of my own life, a life she had chosen to erase from her heart. And as I sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, I knew that the path ahead was uncertain. I did not know if reconciliation was possible, if the bonds of family could ever be mended, or if this act, small in execution, monumental in consequence, was the beginning of the end. But one thing was certain: I had to survive this. I had to find a way to endure, to rise from the quiet ashes of rejection, and to confront the truths that had long been buried beneath polite smiles and silent dinners. The next morning, the sun rose over our small English town with an indifferent brilliance, spilling pale light across the rooftops and cobblestone streets. I sat at the kitchen table, my tea growing cold in the chipped mug I had carried from France, thinking about the note that had been left on my luggage. "No room for you." The words swirled in my mind like smoke, both taunting and impossible to grasp. I had reread them dozens of times, hoping that in repetition I might uncover some hidden meaning, some accidental kindness, some hint that it was a prank or a misunderstanding. But the truth was clear, and it hit me harder with each repetition. My daughter had wanted me gone. I didn't want to think about what had led to this. Yet I could not help myself. Memories came unbidden, images flickering like old films in my mind. I remembered the first time I felt her distance growing. She had been 10, maybe 11, and I had taken her to the city for a day of sightseeing. We walked the streets of Paris, her small hand tucked into mine, marveling at the riverboats on the Seine. I had laughed and told her stories about my own childhood, about adventures I had dreamed of but never taken. She had smiled, but there had been a flicker in her eyes, a hesitation, a quiet judgment that I had ignored at the time. I thought about the subtle changes in her behavior over the years, the way she avoided sharing details of her life, the way she answered questions with half-truths, the way she would storm out of rooms in anger, leaving me bewildered and hurt. I had assumed she was growing into herself, finding independence, learning to assert her voice. But now, I wondered if it had been more than that. Had the resentment been brewing all along? Had I missed the warning signs because I wanted to believe in the perfect image of mother and daughter I had imagined for myself? The morning dragged on, heavy and silent. I didn't hear her. I didn't hear him. I didn't even hear the phone ring, though it had. Hours passed. I wandered through the house, touching familiar surfaces, her old toys still tucked in the corners, my husband's books neatly stacked on the shelf, the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the hall closet. Everything was as it had always been, and yet nothing was. I tried calling her, my hand shaking as I dialed the number I had memorized for years. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice barely audible. "Please, call me. I don't understand why." I didn't leave my full name, or the words "I love you," because they felt too heavy, too fragile to utter. I hung up before the tears came, though they hovered, threatening to fall like rain. I began to wander the streets outside, desperate for some distraction, some semblance of normalcy. The town was waking up slowly. The baker had set fresh loaves outside his shop, the scent of yeast drifting into the cool morning air. Children clutched their mothers' hands as they walked to school, laughing at small jokes that seemed trivial and yet precious. I envied them. I envied their simplicity, their innocence, the certainty that no one in their small lives would discard them in the way I had been discarded. I found myself at the park, a small green space with benches and a pond. Ducks floated lazily on the water, and the wind rippled across its surface. I sat on one of the benches, trying to collect my thoughts. I had always believed that family was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of unconditional support. But now, confronted with the raw reality of betrayal, I wondered if I had been naive. Perhaps family, like the rest of the world, was fragile and imperfect, capable of immense cruelty even when one least expects it. I thought about my husband. Where was he? Was he complicit? Or was he simply absent, detached from the unraveling of a family he had helped shape? I remembered small betrayals over the years, the silent judgment in his eyes, the way he avoided difficult conversations, the quiet decisions made without consulting me. And yet, I loved him. I loved them both. Perhaps that was my mistake, to believe that love alone could protect me from harm, from the sharp edges of resentment that had been quietly sharpening in my daughter's heart. If you're still here, please, don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. stories about the quiet betrayals that can break a family apart and the moments of truth that follow. As evening approached, I returned home, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The house felt colder now, as if it had absorbed my despair and held it like a living thing. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where my daughter had spent countless hours reading, laughing, and arguing with me. I wondered how a person could turn from a child full of curiosity and warmth into someone capable of this calculated act of exclusion. And then, a memory surfaced, one I had long buried. It was from years ago, a late summer evening, when I had discovered a hidden letter in her drawer. I hadn't meant to read it, but curiosity had overtaken me. The letter was filled with anger and confusion, accusations I didn't fully understand at the time. It spoke of secrets, of decisions made without her consent, of whispers she had overheard that had twisted her perception of me. I had dismissed it as childish drama, a phase she would outgrow. But now, I wondered if it had been the first sign of the rift that had grown into an unbridgeable canyon. I poured myself a glass of wine, trying to steady my trembling hands. The notes of oak and cherry were a small comfort, a fleeting warmth in an otherwise cold reality. I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be painful, filled with questions and truths I was not sure I was ready to face. But I also knew that I could not turn away. The story of my family, my failures, and my betrayals had to be confronted. Night fell, and I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The town, oblivious to my personal calamity, continued its quiet rhythm. Somewhere, inside me, a spark of determination flickered. I would not disappear quietly, discarded like an old suitcase on the driveway. I would confront the truths, unearth the secrets, and, if possible, find a way to heal. Because even in betrayal, there is a lesson. Even in pain, there is a possibility for understanding. And even when it feels as if the world has turned its back, we must find the strength to stand, to remember who we are, and to face what comes next. The days that followed my return were a strange mix of silence and tension. Like walking through a house filled with ghosts, I could not see but could feel pressing close. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind through the curtains, felt like a reminder of what had been taken from me. My daughter did not speak to me. My husband was unreachable, and I, adrift in the middle of the storm, felt the fragile scaffolding of my family life cracking beneath me. I began keeping a journal, writing down everything I remembered, every small instance of resentment or betrayal that had accumulated over the years. Sometimes I wrote long letters to my daughter, letters I never intended to send, spilling out the confusion, love, and pain I felt. I wrote about the vacations we had taken, the long train rides across Italy, the cobbled streets of Florence where she had held my hand and told me about her dreams. I wrote about her first heartbreak, her triumphs at school, the nights she had cried on my shoulder while I whispered reassurances I hoped she believed. Realized that memory was both a blessing and a curse. It reminded me of all the love we had shared, but it also amplified the sense of loss, of how easily it could be erased. I began to notice patterns I had once ignored, the way she had always retreated when conflict arose, how small misunderstandings had grown into long silences. I wondered if my husband had seen it too, and, if he had, why he hadn't acted. The town felt different now. Even familiar streets seemed imbued with judgment, the shops and cafes witnesses to my private despair. I would walk past the local market, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee mingling with the sting of memory. The barista knew me by name and smiled, but I could not return it. The warmth of familiarity was unbearable. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of absence pressing against me, the absence of the family I thought I knew, the absence of the simple comfort of being wanted. One evening, I decided to visit the old library, a quiet place where I could think without interruption. The librarian, Mrs. Carver, greeted me with her usual gentle nod. "You've been away," she said. "Is everything all right?" I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. There was no simple answer. "I'm dealing with something," I said finally. "Family matters." She nodded knowingly, as though she understood more than I could say. I wandered among the shelves, running my fingers along the spines of books, their titles a reminder of other lives, other stories, and other truths. I found a quiet corner and sat down, trying to focus on the words in front of me, but the words blurred. My mind kept returning to the note, to the luggage, to the unspoken accusation in her handwriting. No room for you. I remembered another moment, a day in early spring, when she had confronted me about a secret I had kept. She had been 14, standing in the garden with arms crossed, and she had demanded the truth about a distant relative I had never spoken of. I had hesitated, wanting to protect her from the complexity of adult secrets, and she had exploded with frustration. "You think you know what's best for me," she had shouted. "You think I don't see the world around me." I had held her in my arms, trying to calm her, but I felt a shift that day, a subtle realignment of power in our relationship. She had begun to see me differently, as someone fallible, someone capable of error, and perhaps, in that shift, the first seeds of resentment had taken root. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about love, loss, and the quiet betrayals that can change the course of our lives. That night, I sat in the living room with the faint hum of the heater filling the silence. I thought about confronting her, calling her, demanding an explanation. But fear held me back, not of her reaction, but of what I might discover. What if the reasons for her cruelty were more than I could bear? What if the truth shattered the fragile threads that remained of my heart? I found myself walking through the hallway that led to her room, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I did not enter. I could feel the story she had built for herself behind that door, walls constructed from half-truths and unspoken grievances. I realized then that the distance between us was not only physical, but emotional, forged over years of misunderstanding, secrecy, and unhealed wounds. I remembered another conversation, one late night when she had been 17. She had caught me reading her diary, and the look in her eyes was one of betrayal and heartbreak. "I trusted you," she had cried. "I thought you loved me." I had apologized, but the damage had been done. The diary had contained fears and thoughts she had never shared with anyone else, and by reading it, I had broken an unspoken trust. Perhaps this was the moment when the gap began to widen, the moment that would eventually lead to a note on a driveway and luggage left in the sun. I spent the following days in a haze, walking and writing and reflecting, trying to piece together the chain of events that had led to this moment. The past and present collided, memories and reality intertwining. And yet, despite the despair, a small spark of hope remained. Somewhere inside me, I knew that understanding, even if it was painful, was possible, that the path forward, however difficult, could lead to truth and, perhaps, reconciliation. I began to gather the courage to ask questions, to confront the shadows in our hallway, and to search for the truth that lay hidden behind the walls of my home. I knew that doing so would not be easy. There would be resistance, anger, maybe even more rejection. But I also knew that silence had already done enough damage. It was time to seek answers, no matter the cost. And so, as the days lengthened into late summer, I prepared myself for the confrontation, for the revelations that awaited, and for the moments that would demand all of my strength and courage. The story of my family was far from over, and I was determined to see it through, no matter what truths might be uncovered. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves in distant rain. I stood by the kitchen window, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. I didn't drink it. Instead, I watched the neighborhood waking up, trying to find in its ordinariness some measure of comfort. But nothing ordinary could erase the feeling of estrangement that had taken root in my home. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my daughter's anger was not entirely without reason. Perhaps there were things I had done, things I hadn't seen or understood, that had driven her away. The thought made my chest tighten. For so long, I had seen myself as the protector, the nurturer, the one who had kept the family safe from the chaos of the world. But had I missed the chaos inside her heart? Had my love, well-intentioned as it was, failed to reach her? I found myself drawn to her room once more. The door was closed, a silent barrier between us, and yet I could feel her presence behind it, like a storm waiting to break. I remembered the times she had retreated here as a child, curling up on her bed with a book or a journal, shutting the world out. She had always been introspective, sensitive, and fiercely private. Perhaps, in my desire to guide and protect her, I had inadvertently silenced her, diminished her need to express herself. I began to look through our home with new eyes, noticing the small things I had overlooked for years. A photograph on the mantelpiece showing her smiling in the sunlight, taken on a summer trip to Italy. A crumpled note on the fridge, a reminder of an argument I couldn't fully recall. Each item felt loaded with unspoken meaning, a silent testament to the complexities of our relationships. I remembered another pivotal day, years ago, when I had discovered a hidden folder on her computer. I hadn't meant to pry. It had been open on the screen when I walked in. Inside were emails and messages she had never shared, conversations with friends and teachers, confessions of anger and fear I hadn't fully understood at the time. I had confronted her gently, thinking to guide her through whatever confusion she felt. But her response had been sharp and distant. "You never listen," she had said. "You only see what you want to see." Those words haunted me now. Had I truly listened? Had I been blind to her suffering, dismissive of her voice in my desire to protect her? The thought made my chest ache. I wanted to reach her, to tell her that I understood, that I was willing to change, to listen. But the distance between us seemed insurmountable, a chasm carved by years of misunderstanding and unspoken grievances. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about the fragile threads of family, the misunderstandings that grow into mountains, and the courage it takes to face them. That afternoon, I decided to visit the local cafe where she had often spent time with friends. Perhaps seeing the spaces she occupied, hearing the voices of people who knew her in ways I did not, would offer me insight. The barista greeted me warmly, and I asked casually if my daughter had been there recently. He shook his head, but then hesitated. "She hasn't been coming around," he said softly. "Not since last month. Something happened, I think." His words were both a confirmation and a puzzle. I left the cafe with more questions than answers, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The streets seemed narrower now, the walls of the town closing in around me. I thought about the ways she had changed, the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the quiet rebellion that had grown into this final act of exclusion. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner for one, I reflected on the complexity of family bonds. Love, I realized, is not always enough. It can falter, waver, and even be weaponized when combined with misunderstanding, fear, and resentment. I thought about my husband again. What role had he played in this widening gap? Had he seen the signs and ignored them, hoping they would resolve themselves? Or had he, too, been lost in his own patterns of avoidance and silence? The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, an apology, a confrontation, a revelation. I didn't know what, exactly, but I knew that the truth would come, one way or another. And when it did, I would have to face it fully, without flinching, without retreat. Later that night, I wandered to the window once more, staring out at the empty streets. The town was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a car or the occasional barking of a dog. I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a tingling that hinted at the approaching storm. Something was about to be revealed, some truth long buried that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. And as I sat there, tracing the lines of the rooftops with my eyes, I realized that I had reached a point of no return. The silence, the betrayal, the unspoken resentments, they could no longer remain in the shadows. I would have to confront them, unearth them, and face the reality of what had become of the family I had loved so deeply. Because in that confrontation lay the possibility of understanding, perhaps even redemption. And I knew, deep in my heart, that I could not turn away. The following week, I noticed a shift in the air of the house. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, like the moment just before a storm breaks. I could feel it in the tension of the walls, the way the rooms seemed smaller, the way my own footsteps echoed differently. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the estrangement, carrying it in its foundation, waiting for something to give. I began searching for clues, anything that might explain the note on the driveway. I rifled through old letters, revisited photographs, and even opened drawers I had long left untouched. I found reminders of birthdays I had forgotten, apologies I had never offered, and small mementos of moments I had overlooked. Each discovery was like a thread leading me toward the truth, though I had no idea where the threads would lead. One afternoon, I received a message from her school. It was brief, almost clinical, but it carried weight. She had been struggling academically, the note said, and had withdrawn from social activities. My heart sank. How had I not noticed? How had I missed the signals that something deeper than teenage rebellion had been at play? The guilt hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless and shaking. I remembered another argument. Years ago, when she had accused me of hiding things from her, I had laughed it off, insisting that some truths were too complex, too adult for her to understand. But now, I realized how wrong I had been. She had sensed the omissions, felt the gaps in my words, and had stored them away, building walls between us. Each secret I had kept in the name of protection had become another brick in the barrier separating our hearts. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about hidden truths, unspoken resentments, and the moments that define who we are and who we love. The next evening, I decided to leave the house for a walk, hoping the cool air and movement might bring clarity. I wandered down familiar streets, past shops and cafes I had known for years. Everything looked the same, but I felt like a stranger in a familiar land. Children laughed on playgrounds, couples strolled hand in hand, and everywhere I looked, life moved forward without waiting for me to catch up. I stopped by the park, where I often brought her as a child. The swings creaked in the wind, empty now, and I sat on a bench, letting the memories wash over me. I remembered teaching her to ride her first bike, her hands gripping mine as she wobbled and fell, and the look of exhilaration when she finally rode alone. I remembered the nights she cried for me to stay by her side, the mornings she demanded breakfast in bed, and the long conversations about her dreams and fears. Each memory felt like a dagger now, a reminder of all I had lost, all I had failed to protect. That night, I returned home and found a letter slipped under my bedroom door. It was brief, written in her neat, precise handwriting. "Mom, I need space. I will explain when I am ready." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. She was speaking, yet withholding, offering a piece of herself, yet keeping the rest hidden. I held the paper in my hands, feeling the sharp edge of longing and fear. I knew then that the journey ahead would not be easy. The truth she had buried so carefully would not reveal itself gently. I would need patience, courage, and perhaps the humility to accept that the story of our family was far more complicated than I had imagined. The days that followed were filled with careful observation and quiet reflection. I watched her from a distance when she ventured outside, noting the subtle ways she moved, the expressions she wore, the moments of vulnerability she tried to hide. I saw the tension in her shoulders, the flashes of anger that quickly disappeared, the sadness she could not fully conceal. And I began to understand. Her actions, as hurtful as they were, came from a place of fear and confusion, not malice. I remembered my own childhood, the moments when I had felt abandoned or misunderstood, and realized how easily pain could be internalized, carried silently, and eventually expressed in ways that hurt those we love. Perhaps my daughter's betrayal was not just about me, but about a cycle of hurt and misunderstanding that had stretched across generations. I began to see patterns I had never noticed before. The way my husband avoided confrontation, the way I had tried to protect my daughter by withholding certain truths, and the way she had responded to both with anger and withdrawal. It was a web of interactions, each thread tugging at the others, creating tension that finally snapped in the form of that note on the driveway. As I sat alone one evening, staring at the photograph of us taken years ago on a sunny day in Italy, I realized something profound. The path to reconciliation would require honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. It would not be enough to express love. I would need to understand, to listen, and to acknowledge the pain we had both carried silently for so long. And in that realization, a fragile hope emerged. Perhaps it was not too late. Perhaps, through patience, courage, and the willingness to face our fears, we could rebuild what had been broken. It was a gray, drizzling afternoon when I finally saw her in the living room, standing by the window with her back to me. The rain streaked the glass, blurring the view of the street outside, and somehow it mirrored the confusion clouding my mind. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing what I might say, what I might ask, what I might hear. But now that it had arrived, I felt my voice shrink, hesitant against the enormity of what had to be faced. "Can we talk?" I asked softly, my words nearly swallowed by the quiet. She turned, her expression unreadable, eyes a storm of emotions I couldn't immediately name. "I suppose we can," she said, her voice steady but brittle. as though each word had been carefully measured. We sat opposite each other, the distance between us more than just the physical space of the couch. Years of misunderstandings, unspoken grievances, and hidden fears stretched like a chasm, threatening to engulf everything. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but I also feared that any wrong movement could make it collapse entirely. I found your note, I began, voice trembling. The one on the driveway. Her lips tightened. I had to do something, she said. I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't pretend what? I asked, trying to keep my tone gentle. That we're fine. That I don't see the way you've been hurting. She looked away, glancing at the floor as if searching for courage. It's more than that, she whispered. It's everything you didn't tell me. All the secrets, all the choices made without me. The words hit me like stones. I realized then that her anger was not born of cruelty but of confusion and betrayal. She had been carrying a burden I hadn't seen, a collection of omissions and half-truths that I thought were protective, but which had instead driven a wedge between us. I remembered the hidden letters, the emails, the diary I had once glimpsed. Had I dismissed her feelings too quickly? Had I assumed that shielding her from certain truths was an act of love, when in reality it had been a source of pain? I never wanted to hurt you, I said, tears prickling my eyes. Every choice I made, I thought it was for the best. I thought I was protecting you. Her eyes filled with tears as well, and for a moment, the storm of resentment and fear softened. I felt invisible, she admitted. Like my voice didn't matter, like my feelings didn't count. And every time I tried to speak, it felt like you weren't really listening. I reached out slowly, our hands almost touching but not quite, as if the physical act could somehow make up for the years of misunderstanding. I hear you now, I said. I want to hear everything. Please, tell me everything. She hesitated, then began to speak, her voice trembling as she unburdened herself. She spoke of moments I had forgotten, of nights she had cried alone in her room, of frustration at the decisions I had made without her input. She spoke of my husband's absence, of the times she had felt unsupported, and of the secrecy that had seemed to dominate our household. And then, finally, she revealed the truth I had never expected. The note on the driveway had not been written in anger alone. It was an act of fear and confusion. She had been struggling with a financial mistake she had made, a secret she was ashamed of, and she had projected her fear onto me. She had wanted to protect me from her embarrassment, from the chaos she had caused. The revelation stunned me. All these weeks, all the pain, had been compounded by misunderstandings and miscommunication. The act that had felt like rejection was, in fact, a misguided attempt to shield me from harm. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about the tangled webs of family life, and the moments of clarity that can change everything. I sat in silence for a long while, letting her words sink in. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the house seemed to breathe with me, as if acknowledging the fragile reconciliation beginning to take shape. I realized that the path forward would be long and uncertain, but at least now it was illuminated by honesty. Reached for her hand again, this time letting it rest lightly against mine. We'll get through this, I whispered. Together. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, and I saw in her eyes not just fear and regret, but also hope. Hope that despite the fractures, despite the years of pain, we could rebuild. That love, once tested and strained, could still endure. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Betrayal, misunderstanding, and silence can wound deeply, but they do not have to define the story of a family. With patience, courage, and the willingness to listen, even the most broken bonds can begin to heal. The night after our confrontation, the house felt different, not empty, but charged, as if the air itself were holding its breath in anticipation. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards, replaying her words. In my mind, each revelation she had shared, her fear, her frustration, her hidden mistakes, was a key that unlocked years of misunderstanding. And yet, the weight of it pressed down on me the next morning. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, staring out the window at the misty streets. I approached slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between us. "Do you want to talk more?" I asked gently. She nodded, and we began to peel back layer after layer of the past. She confessed the financial mistake she had made, the one that had led to the note on the driveway. It was a small error, easily corrected, but in her mind it had grown into a mountain. She had feared judgment, rejection, and shame, and in her panic, she had lashed out. The truth hit me with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the reason for her actions was not as dire as I had imagined. Sorrow that she had carried such a heavy burden alone. I shared my own memories too, the moments I had tried to protect her, the decisions I had made in the name of love, and the times I had faltered. Our voices overlapped at times, our tears mingled, and for the first time in months, we spoke openly without fear or pretense. As the morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the room with a soft glow, I realized something I had long avoided. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a process. It is messy, uneven, and sometimes painful, but it is also necessary. Without it, the wounds of the past fester, creating scars that shape the future. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about reconciliation, growth, and the quiet courage it takes to face the truth. Later that day, we went through old letters and emails, sorting through memories both bitter and sweet. We laughed at forgotten anecdotes, cringed at miscommunications, and mourned the opportunities lost to silence. Each discovery brought us closer, slowly rebuilding the bridge that had been damaged over years of misunderstanding. I also began to understand my husband's role. He had always been distant, avoiding confrontation, believing that love alone could hold the family together. His absence had allowed tensions to grow unchecked. But now, with clarity and honesty emerging, I felt a sense of resolve. It was time for all of us to confront the truths that had been buried too long. That evening, I found myself standing in the hallway outside my daughter's room, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. She opened the door, a hesitant smile on her face, and gestured for me to come in. The room was familiar, yet transformed by the presence of our new understanding. We sat together on the bed, speaking softly about our dreams, our regrets, and the lessons we had learned. And then, in a moment of vulnerability, she revealed another secret one that had shaped much of her behavior over the years. She had witnessed arguments between my husband and me as a child, moments of tension and hurt that I had assumed she had not noticed. She had internalized the conflict, believing that the instability was her fault. Hearing this, I felt a deep pang of guilt. I had thought I was shielding her, but instead, I had allowed fear and misunderstanding to grow unchecked. The night deepened, and we remained together, talking and listening, crying and laughing, until the hours blurred. For the first time in a long time, I felt the presence of love, untainted by fear, a fragile but persistent light in the darkness. I realized then that the story of our family was not defined by betrayal alone. It was defined by our ability to face the truth, to confront the pain, and to choose understanding over resentment. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was no longer impossible. The following days were a quiet storm of emotions. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a space of fragile negotiation, a place where trust could slowly be restored. Every conversation, no matter how small, carried weight. We spoke of school, work, and shared memories, threading the present with glimpses of the past. Each moment of honesty felt like a stone laid carefully on a bridge spanning years of distance. My daughter began to open up about things she had never shared, the small wounds that had grown in silence, times she felt unheard, choices made on her behalf, and moments of embarrassment she had borne alone. I listened without judgment, offering apologies where necessary, and sharing my own regrets in turn. The simple act of acknowledging our shared pain transformed the air between us. I realized how often I had underestimated her strength. She had carried burdens quietly, navigating her world with resilience and intelligence, even when she felt unsupported. Her courage, which I had sometimes mistaken for arrogance or defiance, was born of necessity. And as I saw her truly, without the lens of my own expectations, I felt a renewed sense of love and respect. My husband, too, began to shift. He joined our conversations slowly at first, hesitant to intrude, but gradually contributing his perspective. He admitted the times he had remained silent, hoping issues would resolve themselves, and recognized the pain his absence had caused. Together, we began to untangle the web of miscommunications and assumptions that had kept us apart. We spent one afternoon in the old park where I had taken her as a child. The swings were still empty, but the memories were vivid. We walked along the paths, talking about hopes for the future, fears of repeating past mistakes, and the desire to build a family bound, not just by love but by understanding. It was in these quiet moments, away from the walls that had once confined us, that I felt the first real sense of healing. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about families fractured by misunderstandings, and the power of courage and honesty to mend what once seemed broken. That evening, back at home, we shared a simple dinner. The conversation flowed easily, laughter breaking through layers of tension that had lingered for years. I watched my daughter, noting the way her shoulders relaxed, the softness in her voice, and the trust in her eyes that had been absent for so long. In that moment, I understood that reconciliation is not a single act, it is a process, a series of choices to be patient, compassionate, and present. Later, as I stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker on, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The path to forgiveness had not been easy, and the scars of the past would remain. But for the first time, I believed we could move forward together. We were no longer trapped by silence or fear. We had chosen truth, and in doing so, we had begun to rebuild. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air clear and crisp. I realized then that healing, like the weather, comes in cycles. Some days are bright and calm, others turbulent and gray, but each day carries the possibility of renewal, of connection, and of understanding. And as I turned from the window to watch my family gathered in the living room, sharing stories and laughter, I knew that the bridges we had begun to rebuild would carry us through the storms yet to come. The past could not be erased, but it could be understood, honored, and transformed into the foundation of a stronger, more resilient family. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a gentle, tentative spring. Each day brought small acts of healing, conversations that were no longer weighted with resentment, laughter that lingered longer than it had in years, and moments of quiet understanding that spoke louder than any words. I began to see my family in a new light, not just as the people who had hurt me or been hurt by me, but as individuals navigating the complexities of life with their own fears, hopes, and vulnerabilities. One afternoon, I found my daughter in the kitchen, her brow furrowed over a school project she had taken on with determination. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, a simple gesture that carried the weight of reconciliation and trust. I realized then how fragile and precious connection truly is, how easily it can be broken, and how much courage it takes to rebuild it. We spoke openly about our past, not as a means of blame, but as a way to understand each other. I acknowledged the mistakes I had made, the secrets I had kept, the times I had failed to see her perspective. She acknowledged the ways she had acted out of fear and misunderstanding, and together, we created a space for forgiveness. It was not instantaneous, nor was it complete, but it was a start. I remembered the note on the driveway, the luggage left outside, and the emptiness I had felt in those first moments of betrayal. And yet, as I looked at my daughter now, I understood that those acts, as hurtful as they had been, were also calls for connection. They were expressions of fear, of shame, and of a need to be seen and understood. What had once felt like rejection had been an invitation to look deeper, to listen harder, and to love more fully. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories about the resilience of family, the courage it takes to face pain, and the hope that grows when we choose love over fear. That evening, my husband joined us in the living room. We sat together, sharing a quiet meal and speaking of plans for the future. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic revelation that solved everything in an instant. Instead, there was something more enduring, a commitment to honesty, a willingness to face challenges together, and the recognition that love is not always easy, but it is always worth the effort. I reflected on the journey we had taken, from misunderstanding and betrayal to reconciliation and understanding. I realized that family is never perfect, and life is never free from mistakes or pain, but it is within the imperfections, the struggles, and the missteps that the deepest lessons are found. The most important lesson I learned is that silence can be as destructive as anger, and that fear and misunderstanding can grow in the spaces left unattended. But equally, love, patience, and honest communication can heal wounds that once seemed insurmountable. It is never too late to reach across the divide, to listen, and to choose connection over isolation. As I watched my daughter laugh at a small joke my husband made, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. The house no longer carried the weight of unresolved tension. It resonated with the possibility of growth, understanding, and shared love. We were not perfect, and we would face challenges again, but now we were equipped with empathy, courage, and the knowledge that even fractured hearts can be mended. And in that moment, I understood that the greatest gift of life is not the absence of pain, but the capacity to rise above it, to forgive, and to love, even when it is difficult. The bridges we rebuild, the conversations we have, and the courage we muster to face the truth, these are the things that define us, that shape our families, and that transform sorrow into resilience. I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet strength of connection settling in my chest. The past had shaped us, the mistakes had taught us, and the love that remained soft, fragile, yet steadfast would guide us forward. We had found our way back to each other, and in doing so, I discovered that even after betrayal, even after fear and silence, love could endure. And perhaps that is the truest story of all. I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet strength of connection settling in my chest. The past had shaped us, the mistakes had taught us, and the love that remains fragile yet steadfast would guide us forward. We had found our way back to each other, and in doing so, I discovered that even after betrayal, even after fear and silence, love could endure. And now I wonder, if you were in my place, could you find the courage to forgive? Could you reach across the distance that years of misunderstanding have built, and rebuild the bridges you thought were lost?